So thank you for coming to tonight's webinar. This is the second in our series of webinars for shareholders and supporters this year. And tonight we'll be doing a focus on our workers' rights work stream. So my name is Emma and I am leading our shareholder work here. And then you'll be hearing from my colleague, Dr. Katie Hepworth, and also my colleague, Vanessa, who are both on the line. Before we get going in earnest, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you from, which are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you're listening from. Tonight, we'll have the webinar in two parts. The first part will be Katie speaking about workers' rights, and then the second part will be Vanessa speaking more about participating in our work as a shareholder or a potential shareholder. If you're already a shareholder who's registered with us, I know that we've got some on the line. You're very welcome to jump off after Katie's part. And if you aren't, or you'd just like to hear a bit more about the specifics, you're very welcome to stay on, and then Vanessa will talk about the details of participating in our work. There'll be an opportunity for questions as well. So at the end of Katie's presentation, you'll be able to ask her questions about her work. So this webinar is being recorded. And if you don't feel comfortable asking questions, you'll be able to send them through as an email. I'll share my screen in a moment so you can see the email address. Otherwise, please feel free to use the Q&A section of the webinar. Just pop it in there and then I'll be able to ask them to Katie. And then if you have any questions relating to shareholdings or participation, I'll just hold them until the end, if that's okay. And again, feel free to email us about that. So that's the email address at the bottom there, shareholders@accr.org.au, if you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable raising during the webinar. So before I hand over to Katie, I'll just do a little bit of an overview of ACCR and our work for those of you who aren't familiar with it. We're a not-for-profit and we are a research and shareholder advocacy organisation. What that means is that we conduct research on the environmental, social and governance performance of Australian listed companies. And then based on our research, we engage with those companies. Sometimes that might lead to a shareholder resolution, and that's something that Vanessa will talk to you more specifically about later. Otherwise, it might take many forms and it might lead to many results, some of which Katie will be able to speak to you about. We focus on 3 different areas of work: climate and environment, human rights, which covers our Indigenous cultural heritage work, and then workers' rights, which Katie will be speaking to you about today. So I think that's it and covers off. Katie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma, and good to be on this presentation to talk about the workers' rights work. There's a lot that's been happening in the last year, and I think with COVID over the last, is it nearly 18 months or something? I think we've really recognised the pressure that's on a lot of workers and what's happening with a lot of companies. It's really brought workers' rights issues to the forefront of the investment sector in a way that we haven't seen to date. A bit of background about me before I kick off. As I mentioned, I'm the Director of Workers' Rights at ACCR, and I'm also ACCR's research manager. So I'm in charge of making sure that all the research that ACCR puts out is of high quality and kind of is leading the way in terms of advocacy within the investment sector. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about a couple of the campaigns that we've run through resolutions and the successes that we've had, but also highlight the way in which we use research really to drive that change at ACCR. Before I came to ACCR, I've worked in a number of different roles. So as the doctorate shows, I was an academic for a while, focused on labour migration and citizen issues. So you're going to see that come through a lot of the work that we're doing here at ACCR, which is really focused on the exploitation of migrant workers, in particular supply chains around Australia. And I took that through into various policy roles where I was working on workers' rights, focusing a lot on care work and gendered labour, as well as migrant workers in the cleaning sector. And then I moved into doing humanitarian work across the Pacific. And a key focus of that work at various points was looking at the seasonal worker program that brought farm workers over to Australia. to work in the supply chains of Coles and Woolies to pick and pack the fruit and vegetables that we all eat every day. And through that work, I became exposed, I guess, to the high degrees of exploitation on Australian farms, as well as, I guess, I got to know many of the workers that are working in rural Australia that have kept us fed really throughout the whole pandemic. And it highlighted to me as I came into ACCR that there was a real need to address those supply chains and really understand the exploitation that was happening there today. So before I get into that, though, I wanted to say that the workers' rights stream at ACCR is really looking at how we address the expansion of inequality within Australia and also how we deliver fair pay and a living wage for workers. We're being focused on, to date, on high-risk supply chains in Australia, supply chains that show evidence of modern slavery as well as excessive wage theft. So the first 3 years of my work at ACCR have been almost exclusively focused on horticulture, and more recently we've started to look at cleaning. We've got a broader section of work that looks at, I guess, the way in which new forms of employment types are driving inequality and undermining working conditions, and so that's going to be something that we'll see emerge next year in a much greater way, and that's the way in which companies outsource. Just go back up a slide, Emma. Thanks, Emma. So I wanted to talk to you about 2 campaigns today that some of you may have helped us co-file. And that's, in the first instance, it's the 3 years of engagement that we've had on Coles and Woolworths. The worker that you see on the screen is Putri Nazari, who's a farm worker that worked on broccoli farms and blueberry farms and other farms across Australia. And I'll talk to you a bit about her story. But first of all, it's important to note that horticulture is one of the highest risk sectors for modern slavery in Australia. I think it was something that was a really hidden risk, but in the last 5 years, it's really exploded, the treatment of farm workers. And now that we've got a shortage of farm workers due to COVID, it's really become really present in our minds. Some of the issues that we find on farms are huge amounts of wage theft. So minimum wage, according to the award on farms, is $24 an hour, but a survey of farm workers found that on average they get paid $14 an hour, and some of them get paid $4 an hour and less. That's before you take into account some of the extortionate fees that they're forced to pay for housing via their labour hire provider. So I guess the most extreme example we've seen in the last few years is 70 workers living to a single 5-bedroom house in Tasmania paying $100 a week, which I think is well above market rates for rent in Hobart. But more commonly, we do see sort of 12, 15 people living to a house. And they're also often paying $100 a week for transport, which is usually a minibus that goes from the farm to the accommodation and back again. We also know that sexual assault is rife on Australian farms. It can take many forms, but it's also because we have high numbers of migrant workers, it often takes the form of passports being stolen and exchanged. Putri Nazari talks about her experience on being on farms where her passport was taken by the employer and she wasn't allowed out to get food. She wasn't allowed out to kind of leave the farm at all while she was working there. And it was only once she had to steal her passport back and make an escape from the farm in order to do that. So what is it that's got us into this position? So there's a lot of reasons why the risks are prevalent. So we have a high number of migrant labour on the farms in precarious visa conditions. So anyone from asylum seekers on bridging visas to backpackers from the UK to backpackers from Malaysia and elsewhere. And a lot of them don't have work rights that allow them to work. And so they're really vulnerable to threats made against their immigration status. We also have a lot of really dodgy labour hire providers. So it doesn't take much to provide labour to Australian farms. You just really need a phone number and an ability to provide labour. And it's also, I guess, and this is where ACCR has come in, it's about the power of the supermarkets to kind of set prices and to drive prices down in the sector. Where ACCR came in is that there are a lot of risks that have been identified. Four Corners had an expose about slavery-like conditions on Australian farms. And one of the solutions that was identified is that rather than dealing with the thousands of different farms individually, we could just deal with 2 companies. And so Coles and Woolies together have 75% of market share by value of all the horticulture produced on Australian farms. They set the prices on Australian farms, and as many people would know from the milk price wars, they're able to kind of drive farm owners really into bankruptcy if they want to through their price setting. But it also gives us a real opportunity for shareholder power to drive change, because there are 2 companies that we can file resolutions on, and we can keep the pressure up to get them to the table. So through shareholder resolutions over a number of years, we've actually got Coles and Woolies to the point at which they are starting to deal with these farm workers. So when we set out with doing shareholder resolutions on farms, Coles and Woolworths denied that they had any responsibility for the farm workers in their supply chain. They said that this was a responsibility of the farms themselves to ensure that the workers were getting paid properly, and they took no responsibility for the fact that their pricing mechanisms meant that the farm owners could not actually pay the farm workers legally. You would know from the price that they're paying for broccolini or for tomatoes that it was just impossible to pay these legal minimum wages. What we've said, and this has been supported now with the passing of the Commonwealth's Modern Slavery Act, is that they had a responsibility through their procurement practices to deal with it, and they had a responsibility to deal with the impacts of their supply chain practices on these workers. So a few years ago, we filed a resolution asking Coles and Woolies to talk about what they were doing in their supply chain and provide a report on the human rights due diligence that they were doing. Ultimately, that resolution against Coles was withdrawn a couple of days ahead of the AGM because Woolworths got word that the vote that year was going to be very, very large. They agreed to sign an agreement with the relevant union that represented farm workers to basically implement what we know of as best practice supply chain due diligence. And that's a due diligence program that has people like Putri at the front of it, advocating for their own their own conditions and overseeing their own farms. So over the year following that, we continued to put pressure on them through that, and we decided to file again because negotiations stalled on implementing an effective due diligence program to deal with supply chain issues. So what we knew of is that it was only when there was an active resolution, it was only through shareholder action that the supermarkets would take action. And so the next year we filed on both Woolworths and Coles in their supply chain. And what we've been really keen to do through the resolutions is heap the pressure on and make sure that Coles and Woolworths cannot put in place systems that are just cosmetic, that just give the illusion of taking action. So we've been working with a number of academics, we've been working with international organisations to really understand what is best practice in workers' rights, and how can we really ensure that what Coles and Woolies is doing works and doesn't just look shiny. So I think we're all really familiar with the idea of greenwashing in the climate space, but less so in the workers' rights space. So what ACCR's work has been doing is really to address that greenwashing type behaviour and ensure that things are really implemented. So where we got to at the end of 2019 was that both Coles and Woolies had agreed to work on a pilot program to ensure that workers' rights were respected throughout the supply chain. And that they held back in March of last year, there was a big town hall meeting that was held that involved workers, suppliers, with supermarkets to really plan out a way forward to implement best practice supplier compliance. Unfortunately, at that point, COVID hit. And we've seen that pilot has really been paused because the problem is that to make that pilot work, we've had to actually have large-scale meetings, which has been impossible to hold. But really, the success of that was delivered because what was able to happen is those relationships that were built through the resolution were able to pivot, and actually we used to develop up quite a successful response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if we talked before about how we had 19, 20, sometimes 70 people living on a house, we just assumed that what we would see in Australia was similar to what we've seen in the US and Europe, which is large-scale transmission. of COVID through farm workers, and we didn't see a single case of transmission. And that was because the systems that we'd set up for a pilot around these resolutions and around the supply chain were able to be utilised to do COVID-19 training and I guess hygiene practices. So I want to flip now to an emerging area. So next slide, Emma. So what we're doing now is we're taking the work and what we've learnt from horticulture into commercial cleaning. Why I've got a question here, and I might stop that and ask that. So why are legal prosecutions not been possible, or are the actions by labour hire firms legal? So the problem is at the moment that we do see some prosecutions, and so there's been a number of high-level prosecutions that have happened of farms. But the problem is we've seen maybe 4 or 5, but there are thousands and thousands of farms out there. And the bigger issue is that the ombudsman themselves say that they're completely under-resourced to investigate all of the non-compliance. So I think investigation by the National Farmers Federation said there's something like 75% of their farmers use undocumented labour. So it's pretty much endemic. It's across all farms. And given the under-resourcing of the regulator, most farm owners that we've spoken to admit that the chance of them getting found out is lower than the chance of them losing a contract from Coles and Woolworths. So they'd rather take the risk and have these illegal underpayments on their sites that they know about, and not lose the contract from Coles and Woolworths by upping their prices to pay legal minimum wages. So that's where we've come in. So it's not an either or. Like, I think regulation is really important, but we also need to change the practices of the supermarkets to make sure that they're paying enough for those farms to do that. And the other problem under the law is there's no way the law only relates to the farm workers themselves. So we need to address the gap in the law and find a way to hold Coles and Woolies accountable in a way that the law doesn't allow them to do. And I guess the other thing is now we do have labour hire regulation that's out there. But again, and so they could get kicked out of the scheme. But again, without Coles and Woolies taking a stand, that will have limited efficacy overall. We have similar dynamics, just to switch to commercial cleaning. So similar dynamics in cleaning. It's sort of it's an area in offices and retail malls where 85% of the cleaning workforce are international students or temporary migrants. So their visa status is quite vulnerable. It's often linked to either their employer or they have limits on how much they can work, limits that are below what will provide them a living wage. So they often work a lot of hours of overtime to do that. It's also an area where large-scale property owners, whether it be, the Dexus or the Westfields of this world, have for years set prices and been able to drive down prices that are below that, which will pay legal minimum wages. It's a really similar dynamic to what we see in security. And if you hark back to the beginning of the pandemic, you'll remember that there was transmission through hotel security. And that was because there were 5 layers of subcontracting and no transparency over what was being paid at different levels of subcontracting. So if you remember that example, that is really what we're seeing in cleaning. We're seeing things where workers are routinely underpaid below legal minimums, and it's just really not tracked at all. And so what we've been trying to do is look at the reporting and the practices of large-scale property owners to understand what they're doing and how we can push them. Now, in the property sector, there is a market-driven mechanism that is global best practice, and that's the Cleaning Accountability Framework. So we've been looking to see what it would take to get more and more property owners to sign up to this mechanism that's been recognised by key investors like Australian Super or CBOS Property, so the biggest industry funds, as best practice. And so back in March of this year, we went to file a shareholder resolution against the owner of Westfield Centre Group. What we wanted them to do is report really at that time on what steps they were taking to protect their workers during COVID. And so that was making sure that their prices were paying legal minimum wages, how they ensured that WHS issues were being met, and the nature and operations of of grievance mechanisms. So the mechanisms that workers can use to raise issues that they see on site around their exploitation. The centre group came to the table on the day of filing, and so we withdrew the resolution at that point. So we didn't file, but thanks to anyone that was on this call that helped us file that was due to help us file that resolution. Without the 100 shareholders there, that threat would have been meaningless, and we wouldn't have got to a point where we were able to withdraw a resolution on the day of filing. And so they agreed to boost pandemic reporting, and we've seen that reflected in the modern slavery reports that they've put out. And that they've provided us with additional information to assess how they're treating the cleaning staff in their buildings. We don't think it goes far enough at the moment, and so we recently launched a report. Actually, we did the webinar to launch it this morning, that looks at the policies and practices of the top 7 largest retail and office buildings, and the due diligence systems that they've got in place. And again, what we wanted to do is to drill down behind the reporting to identify who's been greenwashing. Off the back of that, we've been having lots and lots of meetings with different property owners to understand those practices, and we're now starting to identify which of those property owners we're likely to file resolutions against if we don't get movement against that report, and so if we don't have engagement against that report. And what we do know is the threat of a resolution is a really powerful tool in those negotiations. We know that without that, the property owners would be unlikely to move as quickly as they are. They would be unlikely to give us 3, 4, 5 meetings to work through their reporting and what they're doing, and to actually affect change in a timely manner. We would be seeing, without the resolutions, we'd likely see what we've seen in the UK, which is 5 years after the Modern Slavery Act, very little change has happened. And people that have reviewed the responses of companies have said that there has been no improvement on the modern slavery approaches of companies over the 5 years of the Act, with a few exceptions. And so given that commercial cleaning and horticulture are the 2 sectors that are at highest risk of modern slavery in Australia, we think it's too crucial and too urgent to let this wait and go through 5 years. And so we've been developing up a resolution plan to hold these companies to account and to make sure that modern slavery is not allowed to kind of persist and propagate in the supply chain. I might leave it there and allow for questions at this point in time. It's a bit of a roundabout thing, so feel free to ask. There are no stupid questions because it can get a bit jargony in the workers' rights space.
Thanks so much. I've just stopped sharing my screen, and Vanessa's going to take over so I can see everybody's questions. So we have another one. So in any sector split between listed and private owners, how do listed compliance give a commercial benefit to private owners?
Right. So that's an interesting question that you asked that. So we did a webinar launch for the report that I put out last week, and the webinar launch was today, and we had an unlisted property owner jump on the call. So in this case, we used the behaviour of an unlisted property owner who we believe is leading to kind of pull along and to show where we want the listed property owners to go. But that's not the case everywhere. And I think what we are seeing is that with property, there is much more that is held by super funds in unlisted assets, and also the properties that they hold directly themselves. And that by filing shareholder resolutions against the listed companies, it forces the large investors to also interrogate all the property that they hold directly and how they're doing that. So it's been an interesting approach for ACCR, because we typically only engage on listed companies, but by putting forward resolutions, we're also able to have those discussions with large-scale investors about what they're doing in the property that they own directly, and so pull along all of the listed and the unlisted assets together, and it gives us leverage over a greater number of buildings and workers than we'd have otherwise. Yeah, why are resolutions such a concern? I think a lot of different things. So I think there's a reputational thing that goes with this. So resolutions get a lot of media attention, right? So what it does is it shines a spotlight on these companies and their behaviour, and a spotlight that shows that really they're not doing what they want. They're not actually doing what they should be doing in public. So I think there's a real risk of social license that comes with this. And it's something that, you know, if we think about property owners in this case, when we put up a shareholder resolution, it might be the first time that their tenants, for example, think about who cleans the buildings that they're in. And so we find that tenants then start to kind of raise issues with what they're doing. I think as well with property owners, they're not used to having the spotlight shined on them. They're not a consumer brand. And so they really don't know how to take it when we have consumer investor pressure put on them. I guess the other thing that I'd stress is that everyone is very aware at the moment that the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act has come into play this year, and the first round of reporting has just come out. And there are no fines under the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act for companies that don't comply. The way that the Act is seen to work is that consumers and investors put pressure on them. And so these companies at the moment are really aware that this is the mechanism that the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act is going to use to put pressure on them. And so that's resolutions as well as consumer pressure.
We haven't got any more questions, so we might wrap up this part here. But if you do think of anything else that relates to anything Katie has said, do feel free to pop it in the chat, and Vanessa and I will do our best. Otherwise, if you're happy, we'll take them on notice, and then we can get back to you after. We'll pass them on to Katie. So thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks everyone for jumping on the call this evening. Goodbye.
Bye. So now that Katie's leaving, we're going to move on to the next part of the webinar, which is more focused on how you can participate in the type of work that Katie's just described as a shareholder. So if you don't want to hear more about that, or you're already a shareholder and you know all about it, feel free to jump off. All right, it looks like we have lots of people staying, so that's lovely. Oh, Derek, what are you saying? How can we help your advocacy? If we don't hold shares directly. I'll hold that till the end if that's okay, because I think Vanessa will answer it a little bit. And if she doesn't, I will leave it here and then we'll come back to it. But thank you. All right, Vanessa, I'm going to pass over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again. For those who I haven't spoken to before, my name is Vanessa and I work with Emma in the Shareholder Engagement team. So as Emma was saying, this part of the webinar is really about the nuts and bolts of how you can work with us as a shareholder. So it's really for those people who are completely new to this. And I'll take you through sort of the steps that you need to do to get involved. Yeah, so as a brief overview, I'm going to talk about working with us as a shareholder and the different ways you might hold shares. I'll also take you over to the Shareholder Hub and we can talk through how you can register your shares. And that'll bring up the agency agreement and what that means and what it actually does. And I'll cover how you can participate in resolutions with us. And then at the end, we can also talk about other ways you can support us if you don't hold shares directly. If we just go over to the next slide, Emma. Thank you. So before I delve into all that, I think I really want to touch on the fact that it really takes a really special group of people who we always try to find and connect with, because that's a big part of my job and Emma's job, to find the people who not only care, but also hold shares. And it's a really special intersection of people. And when I say people who care, it's anyone who cares about the ESG issues that we advocate for, from climate to cultural heritage issues to the workers' rights issues that Katie was speaking about tonight. But it's also people who hold shares in listed companies and would like to use their ownership powers to then make a difference in those issues. And so it is definitely a very special group of people, which is why we're really happy that all of you joining us tonight have taken an interest in this. And we're really excited to talk to you. And if we just go to the next slide, we always like to take people through this process with this comic. And this comic was actually created by Holly Jones, who's a shareholder with us and also an artist who's taken part in a lot of shareholder resolutions with us. So she's very familiar with the process. And in this part of the comic, what you can see is depictions of shareholders that actually exist or types of shareholders that actually exist in our community currently. And these are people that may have invested their shares and earn a dividend from them, and they've invested shares to earn an income, but then they've also thought about using their shares to make a bigger impact or invest in a way that aligns with their values. And that's sort of where we come in. And they might have heard about us from their financial advisor or from friends and family, and then they go and register their shares. And so what happens after they register their shares, if we could just pop to the next slide, thank you. We go away and we do a bunch of research, we do company engagement, we talk to affected communities, and then we also prepare all the paperwork to then lodge a resolution to the company. And so in order to do that, we do need 100 shareholders. So we gather our community, and we, as a collective community, we put to companies this resolution. And Katie touched upon this a bit earlier about, why these shareholder resolutions are so powerful. And they are indeed a really powerful tool. And oftentimes the most successful resolutions are actually the ones that are withdrawn. So for example, Centre Group, which was mentioned by Katie earlier today, that's an example where we did withdraw our resolution because the act of actually filing or the threat of a resolution actually was enough to enable the change that we wanted to see. And so that's kind of why lodging these resolutions is very powerful, and it allows us to talk to fellow shareholders and to the company, and it really drives our engagement with these companies. And so if we go to the next slide, it's we'd like it to be a really empowering process for everyone. And we always go back to you and tell you what's happened with the shares and what's happened if you've decided to take part in these resolutions. And so we'll always deliver that news to you. And it is a light touch process. So if you don't want to be involved in a very, if you only want to be involved in a high level way, I guess, you don't have to do much beyond registering your shares. And if we just go to the next slide, before we pop over to the hub and I take you through what you need to do to register your shares, it's a good idea to know whether you own your shares directly or indirectly. So the reason why this is important is because in order to take part in these resolutions, you do need to be a direct owner of your shares. And essentially what that means is, as an individual, you own shares under, for example, maybe your own name or your self-managed super fund, or maybe like a family trust. And these sort of example names that we've got underneath here are just what your shareholding name would look like if you owned your shares directly. And all this means is that you actually have a direct voting power. And that's in contrast to indirect ownership. And so this is kind of the way that most of us would hold shares through our superannuation funds, because we would be beneficial owners of those shares. So we would still benefit financially from them, but we do not have any sort of direct voting power. So we can't tell our super which companies to invest in, and we can't tell them which way to vote in resolutions. And so that's why it's really important to make sure you own your shares directly if you want to register them with us. But having said that, it doesn't mean that if you own them indirectly, there are no other ways you can support us as well, and we can touch on that in the end. But that's just a good thing to keep in mind. And it can be really confusing to find out whether you own shares directly or indirectly. So please do email Emma or me if you ever get confused and want to just find out. Sometimes sending us the name of your shareholding is enough for us to figure out which way it is. And if we go to the next slide, I think this is where I'm going to take you through the hub. So Emma, I'm just going to share my screen now. This is sort of what the hub looks like. If I'm just going to pop this over here. And if you go to our website, it's actually in this little top right-hand corner here. I know it's not the most obvious place. We are working on getting it into a bit more, in a place where it's a bit more obvious. But if you do come to our website, you can see our news and research here. But if you want to register your shares, you just have to hop over to the top right-hand corner, which will take you to this page. And then all you have to do is click here to register. So this is where you'll also go if you ever want to update your holdings. So if you've ever sold your shares and you want to let us know, you can also do it here, or you can email us. But it'll prompt you if you've already logged in before, but if you haven't, you can just continue. And here I'm just going to explain sort of some of the information we collect from you. So this is just the minimum amount of information we need in order to verify that you do have your shareholdings are the same in terms of what appears on the registry. And this is because every time you purchase a parcel of shares, that appears on a company's register. And when we lodge a resolution with your shares, the company will actually go and match each shareholder against that registry. And so what Emma and I do before we lodge a resolution is we always go to the registry and check that as well. And so this is sort of the information we check. So all we need is really your name, the name of the actual shareholding, and an address and an email address. You don't really need to put your phone number in there because we will rarely ever call you. And then the last thing is the HIN number. Now this is sensitive, financially sensitive information, which is why we don't ask for the full number. We only ask for the last 3 digits. And that's just because that's more of a prompt for us to check whether you hold the shares. And only about maybe 10 to 15% of our shareholders, sometimes there are issues where maybe they don't hold the shares or they aren't held in the right way, or there's some other issue. And so this hint, the HIN, the last 3 digits of it is just a good prompt for us. So we don't collect the full thing. It would just be the last 3 digits. And then the other thing is, if you can, please let us know how you found out about us, because that really helps us out while we try and reach more of you in the community. And so if I just type in my name and I pretend that I have a self-managed super fund, just to take you through these steps, I'll just make up the fake address. I'm in Sydney. I'll just pop my email address in here. And then I'll take you to the next page. And this is just where you tell us what companies you own shares in. So there are about 90 to 100 companies here, I believe. And these are all companies that we're currently engaging with, or we may be likely to engage with in the future. And when you tick them, so if I just go ahead and tick any, you don't actually, it doesn't lock you into participating in these resolutions if you don't want to. It really is just a way for us to know how many shareholder numbers we have in each company. And that really helps us for when we start engaging with companies. It's good to know whether, is it plausible for us to file a resolution if we have, way less than 100 shareholders, or if we have way more, then we know that that's an option. And so that this information just feeds into our database, and it's very helpful for us to know exactly how many shareholders we have in each of these companies. So if you just tick whatever you have, it'll take you to this page. Now this is where you appoint us as your agent, and all that really means is that you allow us to lodge a resolution on your behalf. And if you ever want to read the agency agreement terms, they're actually here, linked on our website. Or actually, if you want to go to the hub as well, it's right here as well always. But all this really is it doesn't really let us do anything other than lodge a resolution on your behalf. There's no, so we can't, do anything with your shares. We can't vote your shares any certain way. It only just allows us to sort of collect the information on this form, collate it in a form or in a document, and then present it to the company that we're filing a resolution for. And we tell them that, you've consented to us filing a resolution with these shares. And that's all it really does. And if, you're curious about what the agreement is, you can always read about it here. But in summary, that's all it really does. It appoints us an agent. It doesn't really lock you into participating in any resolutions, because we always go back to you and give you a chance to opt out of any resolutions if you do want to. And so, yeah, if you just tick that, that will take you through, and then you'll submit that. And in terms of communication, once we receive your registration, and if we happen to be considering filing a resolution to a company that you do hold shares in, we will reach out to you and we'll ask, we're putting together this resolution. Here's what the resolution is about. And do you want to participate? So you always have a chance to say, yes, this is great, I want to be part of it, or no, I don't want to, and then we won't include you on that list of 100 shareholders. And so if you do say yes, then we file. And then sometimes it gets withdrawn. Like I said, sometimes that's a good result. Sometimes it goes to a shareholder vote, and you're welcome to attend that AGM as well. But we'll always go back to you and tell you exactly how it went and sort of the results we've been able to achieve. So you'll get that minimum level of communication from us, but we won't be harassing you all the time about things. It'll just be as much as you want to know, but we'll give you that minimum level of sort of updates along the way. And I think one more thing to cover, the question earlier about other ways you can get involved if you don't hold shares. So we're always looking to, grow our community. So I think if anybody if you would like to share this with your family and friends, we're always very grateful for that. You can also become a member with us. And if you would like to do that, you're welcome to email Emma and myself about it. We can talk to you more if you'd like to. It's also end of financial year, so I can mention, I think that if you want any DGR donations to us, we're a philanthropically funded organisation as well. So that's always good if before tax time you want to do that. But other than that, if you want to find out more about how to support us and you don't own shares directly, Emma and I are always happy to chat, whether it's if you want to give us a call or email us, that's always good. And I think that's sort of the main things I wanted to cover. And I think I've actually finished a little bit early.
Vanessa, I'll be a terrible backseat driver, and that you might go through the FAQs.
Yes, the FAQs. So this is our FAQs page here. And you'll see a lovely video of Emma if you'd like to watch her answer all these questions. And she answers all these questions that are down here if you'd like to read about them. And so some of these I have covered a little bit tonight, but this is all about the agency agreement. And so it just explains what I've said today about what it allows us to do and what it doesn't allow us to do. And essentially it's like taking away the administrative burden of filing a share. And so we do that for you. And this just goes into a bit more detail about sort of the obligations we have. And it also mentions there's no cost involved in registering your shareholdings. So that's completely free to do so. And it won't affect your shareholdings in any way. And another thing to mention is the agency agreement does have an end date. I think currently it's a period of 3 years, and jump in if I'm wrong, Emma, but I believe that's 3 years. And sometimes we can ask you if you want to roll over, or if you don't want to, that's fine also. This goes through registering your holdings. And people would register them in different ways. Some people do it through their financial advisor. Some people sign up their shares themselves, or if some people are also happy for us to do it for them, if that's easier for you as well. And then updating your information, like I said, you can come back to the hub to update your information. But a lot of the time people also just email us, and Emma and I can do it from the back end as well. Yeah, this goes through supporting resolutions. And with supporting resolutions, like I said, it's really about how much you want to get involved. You can support a resolution 1 year and then decide not to do it the next year. It's completely fine, because sometimes it depends on what the resolution is about. Some people might not agree with certain things, and some people but might agree with other things. And so it's really about how much you want to get involved, and we'll always give you a chance to sort of have a conversation with us and see what you'd like to do. And that's our FAQs page. So it's really great. I know it's a bit dense. We'll probably work on making it a bit more streamlined in the future. But if you're not into reading all of that, you can watch this great video of Emma here and she'll explain it verbally to you as well. But that's it from me. Would you like me to share my screen, Emma, or do you want to go back to?
Yes, if you could go back to the Q&A page, that would be
sure.
And I'll answer a question while you're doing that. So
Yep.
Anne asked us, how do you vote the proxies that you hold on issues other than resolutions that you are sponsoring? Which is an excellent question. Before I answer that, I might backtrack a little to explain the difference between being a shareholder, one of the 100 shareholders that ensures that we can put up a resolution, versus voting your proxy, because it's something that often gets confused, and there is a little section about it on the FAQs. But you can do both or neither. So say you're a shareholder in BHP and you've registered those shares with us, and then we let you know that there's going to be a resolution and you say, yes, I would love to be a part of that. You can be that one of 100 shareholders who makes sure that that resolution gets onto the company AGM agenda. And then once it's on the agenda, every shareholder in the company gets to vote their proxy for that resolution. So they might vote it in favor, they might vote it against, or they might abstain. And if you've been one of the 100 shareholders, we would hope that you would vote in favor. But what we do once a resolution gets on the agenda is then have meetings with all the other investors in that company to talk to them about the issue that we've raised and to try and get them to vote in favor too. So that is that. And so as the ACCR, we hold shares in all of the companies that we're putting resolutions to, because it's part of, we're able to do it as an owner. It's an ownership power. But our resolutions are, of course, not the only resolutions that are on the agenda of a meeting. There's kind of business as usual ones, such as accepting the annual report, a financial report, and then there's ones that are put forward as shareholders. And there's other organizations that might put a shareholder resolution forward as well, such as Market Forces. And we do share a lot of supportive shareholders between us. And you're probably familiar, if you're one of them, with my counterpart there, Rachel. And there are some other organizations that have been playing in this space as well. So as an owner, the ACCR, we also vote our proxies. So we do vote them in favor of resolutions that we've put forward, and also resolutions that other organizations like ours have put forward. One of my jobs this year is to put together a proxy voting policy that outlines how we vote all of our other shares as well. And that's something that we don't do at the moment and don't have available. And so that's something that I'll be working on. We'll be looking to, you might be familiar with, we do a report every year called Vote Your Super. And it's looking at how other large institutional investors like superannuation funds vote on ESG resolutions in Australia and overseas. And so we kind of look at what best practice of voting disclosure looks like, who's voting in favor of what, and kind of what those ESG resolutions kind of map to their member base. And so we'll be using kind of what we learn and what we expect from other people to inform the way that we vote our proxies, and then how we disclose on them as well. So sadly, work in progress. I do the voting of the proxies. And so currently we do vote on all ESG themed resolutions, but we're going to expand that to kind of voting all of our holdings, and then have a public record of how we vote. So that's something we're hoping. I don't know if I'll get myself together for this half of the year, but hopefully for next year going forward, we'll be doing that regularly, and we'll be publicly disclosing on it as well. So thank you for that question. I think we've answered all the questions there are, but if anybody has any others, do feel free to jot them in. Otherwise, we might have a little early mark, which is always good.
Thanks, everyone. And just before I forget as well, we've got our social media links or social media accounts down there if you want to follow us and stay tuned to the work we're doing. And our email address is there as well. So feel free to just email Emma and I any questions if you have any after this.
Absolutely. We've got one more from Anthony, and it's another very good one. Is there a minimum holding to be one of the 100 shareholders? Technically, to participate, you need to only have one share, but the minimum trade on the ASX is $500 worth. So I guess it's not an insignificant financial barrier to participate. I myself hold minimum holdings in many of the companies that we put resolutions to, because that's all that I can afford. But if there was a company or an issue that you were particularly interested in that you didn't already have a holding in, you would be looking at least $500 parcel to be able to participate. And we do have a number of shareholders who do that for issues that are particularly important to them and companies that they're particularly interested in. So we've got one more question. Have you any resources on how to raise ESG concerns with fund managers who invest on our behalf, like BlackRock or Vanguard? That's a great question too. Businesses like BlackRock and Vanguard, they're kind of known as passives, and so they typically aren't very interested in ESG issues and kind of more go with the flow. So that's one of, I guess, the next areas of the financial sector that we want to be able to influence. And BlackRock, we've been doing quite well with over the last kind of year. And I can't speak to it too specifically because it's not my area of work. It's more the area of Bryn and Katie and Dan, who you might have heard from before as well. But I think being a passive is an increasingly, I guess, I don't even know how to describe it, maybe unfashionable way to be as an investor. There's just so much pressure from everyone really to take a more active interest and to be more active owners. And I think passive funds are feeling that and so are engaging with us more. But it's a big education piece. And I think that's where a lot of our research is really, really important, because a lot of the issues we focus on just haven't been, I guess, engaged with by the investment sector in a very meaningful way before. So the research we produce, the meetings that we take are very important, but it's also, unfortunately, a slow process, and I think a many-year one. But in terms of advice or resources for other people, we don't really have any that are publicly available. I might send you an email after and see. I think if you're a super fund member, I think Market Forces does a really good job of campaigning for fund members to influence the behavior of their super funds. And that's a good place to look for information like that and campaigns around that. But it's not something that we have available at the moment. All right, and if no question pops in while I'm wrapping up, we might leave it there. Happy early mark evening for everyone. Thank you so much for coming and for participating. It's so lovely to speak with you. Oh, one question. Oh, thank you for your time. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think Vanessa and I have the very lovely job of being able to work with our shareholder community, and it's a much happier role than I think some of our colleagues who are working with investors all day have. It's a bit more combative. So we very much enjoy being able to have a really meaningful relationship with the shareholders that we work and support, which is nice. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, big thank you to Vanessa, her first webinar explaining everything we do, which is exciting. And yeah, thank you. If you have any other questions, feel free to email us. And thank you for spending the evening with us.